It began with a single misplaced stone in a basement in Cincinnati. Not a cornerstone, not a brick, a slab of polished red granite, cooling to the touch, bearing a radial symmetry that defied the crude masonry surrounding it. The year was 1883. While the world looked toward the industrial promise of the Gilded Age, something was being extracted from the American soil that the history books would later decline to mention. Ask yourself why a residential foundation would require the load distribution of a cathedral. Ask yourself why the soil density beneath our feet varies so violently in places where the official record claims nothing but empty prairie existed. I touched the surface of that stone. It wasn't chiseled, it was molded, not carved, not cut, something else. The grain of the stone flowed like liquid, frozen in a state of impossible permanence. If you look at the municipal records from that autumn, you will find a curious gap. 3 weeks of ledger entries missing, a sudden surge in private security hiring, a wall of silence erected by the local historical society. This was the first thread, the first fraying edge of a tapestry that covers a continent. We are told the pioneers moved west into a vacuum. We are told they tamed a wilderness, but the blueprints of the cities they supposedly built from scratch tell a different story. They tell a story of inheritance. They tell a story of occupancy. Observe the height of the windows in the surviving structures of that era. Consider the scale of the doorways. They were not built for us, not for our height, not for our reach, something else. If you measure the riser height of the original staircases in the lower levels of the Chicago Grain Exchange, you find a standard that exceeds the ergonomic capacity of the 19th century human frame. We are led to believe this was mere stylistic grandiosity, a flourish of architectural vanity, but architecture is a science of utility. You do not build a door 12 feet high to accommodate a man who stands 5'6". You do not spend the capital of a young nation on oversized thresholds unless the thresholds are necessary. We must look at the excavations, not the ones documented in the Smithsonian sanitized bulletins, but the private accounts, the letters from foremen to wives, the frantic telegrams from surveyors who found more than just minerals. In 1883, the expansion of the railways wasn't just a feat of engineering. It was a systematic dredging of an older world. Every mile of track laid was a mile of evidence buried. Every tunnel through the Appalachians was a surgical removal of a past that did not fit the narrative. What if the great fires of the late 19th century were not accidents? Not Chicago, not Boston, not Seattle, not San Francisco. Something else. Look at the photographs of the ruins. Notice the way the granite has vitrified. Stone does not melt at the temperature of a wood fire. Brick does not liquefy under the heat of burning timber. There is a thermal signature in those ruins that suggests an intentionality of destruction, a cleansing by flame. The official record calls it tragedy. The evidence suggests an eviction. When you burn a city to its foundations, you create a legal and physical vacuum. You allow for the new to be built directly over the old, using the old foundations as a convenient, pre-existing basement. This is institutional gatekeeping at its most violent. By 1884, the narrative was set. The giants were relegated to mythology. The grand architecture was rebranded as neoclassical. The history was rewritten to ensure that the inheritors felt like creators, but the giants left marks that fire cannot erase. They left a geomancy in the street layouts. They left a frequency in the stone. The pattern expands. From the Ohio River Valley to the steppes of Eurasia, the same anomalies recur. The star forts, the impossible domes, the atmospheric electricity collectors that we are told are merely decorative spires. Consider the Tartarian influence, a term scrubbed from the maps of the 20th century. Why does a civilization that occupied the majority of the known world simply vanish from the curriculum? It is not a matter of collapse, it is a matter of erasure. In 1883, the Smithsonian Institution dispatched dozens of field agents to the American West. Their mission was not to preserve, it was to collect and sequester, not to educate, not to archive, something else. They were the cleaners, they found the mounds, they found the copper-clad skeletons, they found the technology that allowed for the construction of the world's fairs, cities of light that appeared overnight and were demolished just as quickly. Ask yourself why you would build a city of marble and gold just to tear it down 6 months later. Unless it wasn't a fair, unless it was a repurposed city, briefly revealed, then systematically dismantled to prevent the public from asking where the power came from. The erasure is not merely physical, it is linguistic. We use terms like pioneer and settler to imply a beginning, but to settle is to occupy what is already there. To pioneer is to be the first of your kind to find it. The giants, the progenitors of the Tartarian architecture, left behind a world that functioned on a different physics, a physics of resonance, a physics of the ether. When we look at the 1883 discovery, we are looking at the moment the switch was flipped, the moment the free energy of the old world was traded for the metered energy of the new. The giants were too large for the new economy. Their history was too deep for the shallow roots of the modern state, and so they were turned into tall tales. They were turned into fairy tales. But the red granite in the Cincinnati basement still hums. If you put your ear to the stone, you can hear the frequency of a lost world. It is a low, mournful vibration. It is the sound of a truth that has been buried under a century of lies. Follow the money of 1885. See where the philanthropic grants for archaeological preservation actually went. They went to the acquisition of private land where the largest anomalies were found. They went to the construction of museums that served as vaults rather than galleries. We are told that we are the pinnacle of human achievement. We are told that the past was primitive, but the primitive do not move 1,000-ton blocks of stone across mountain ranges. The primitive do not align their cities with the movements of the stars with millisecond precision. Not them. Not us. Something else. There is a coldness in the realization that we are living in the ruins of a much greater house. We are like children playing in the abandoned library of a genius, using the pages of his books to make paper airplanes. We see the shapes, but we have forgotten how to read the words. The 1883 discovery was the last time the books were open. After that, the library was locked. The keys were melted down, and the librarians were replaced by guards. The guards are still there. They are in the universities. They are in the media. They are the ones who scoff at the mention of Tartaria. They are the ones who call the giants a hoax. But look at the Smithsonian's own annual reports from the late 1800s. Before the heavy hand of censorship took hold, they were surprisingly candid. They described skeletons 8, 9, 10 feet tall. They described armor that no man could wear. They described weapons that utilized magnetism. Then, suddenly, the report stopped. The skeletons were lost in transit. The armor was melted down. The weapons were categorized as ritual objects. This is the hallmark of institutional erasure. When the evidence contradicts the power structure, the evidence must cease to exist. But energy cannot be destroyed. It can only be transformed. The energy of the giants, the energy of Tartaria is still here. It is in the ley lines. It is in the cathedrals. It is in the very air we breathe, though we no longer know how to harvest it. Ask yourself what happens to a society that forgets its true origin. It becomes untethered, it becomes easy to manipulate, it becomes a society of consumers rather than creators. By removing the giants from our history, the architects of the 1883 erasure removed our potential. They convinced us that we are small, they convinced us that we are limited, they convinced us that we need their systems, their fuel, their permission. But the stone in Cincinnati remains. It is a silent witness to a time when man, or something like man, was not a tenant but a master. The mystery of 1883 is not just a mystery of bones and buildings, it is a mystery of identity. Who were they? And more importantly, who are we? If we are not the first, then we are the usurpers, and the usurper always lives in fear of the rightful heir's return. The tension in the historical record is palpable. There are anomalies that historians refuse to touch lest their entire career collapse like a house of cards. They speak of out-of-place artifacts as if the artifacts are the problem and not the timeline itself. In 1883, the timeline was fractured. A splinter was removed and the wound was cauterized. But the scar remains. You can see it in the way our modern cities feel discordant. You can see it in the way the old buildings, the ones that survived the fires, seem to glow with a different light. They are out of sync with the modern world because they belong to a different world, a world of giants, a world of Tartaria, a world where the discovery of 1883 wouldn't have been a scandal, but a homecoming. We are coming to the end of the first layer. The surface has been scratched, the granite has been touched, but the deeper we go, the more unsettling the truth becomes. The giants were not just large people, they were a different expression of life. They were the architects of a global harmony that we can barely imagine. Their erasure was not a mistake, it was a coup, a metaphysical coup that changed the course of human history. As we move into the next phase of this investigation, remember the stone. Remember the feeling of the grain that flows like liquid. It is the only thing that is real. Everything else, the textbooks, the monuments, the official narratives, is just smoke. Not truth, not history. Something else. The shadows are lengthening, and the basement is getting colder. But we have to keep digging. We have to see what is under the granite. We have to see what they were trying to keep down. The excavation into the substrata of the 1883 event leads us inevitably to the soil of the American Midwest, where the silence is loudest. If you examine the topographical surveys of the Ohio River Valley prior to the industrial expansion of 1884, you will see a landscape pockmarked by geometry. These were not natural hills. They were not refuse heaps. They were complex, mathematical earthenworks, square, circle, octagon, nested shapes that fit, mirrored the constellations above with a precision that would require aerial observation to achieve. Yet, we are told these were the works of nomadic tribes, with no written language and no metallurgy. Ask yourself how a culture without mathematics constructs an equilateral triangle spanning 3 miles. Ask yourself why the Smithsonian agents arrived with shovels and left with crates that required 6 men to lift. The erasure was physical. The mounds were levelled to make way for the gridded streets of the new American order. But some things were too massive to be levelled. Some things had to be built over. In the archives of the 1880s, there exists a recurring mention of the deep infrastructure. This was the term used by surveyors for the pre-existing stone conduits found beneath the topsoil. They found plumbing that did not lead to wells. They found tunnels lined with a glass-like substance that glowed when struck by a torch. Not gas, not oil, something else. The reports described these tunnels as being sized for a different gait, a different stride. The load distribution of these subterranean arches suggests they were designed to support weights that our modern locomotives could never reach. In 1883, the Great Northern Railway discovered a series of these tunnels while cutting through the Dakota Territories. The official report states they were natural lava tubes. But lava does not form right angles. Lava does not leave behind copper plating on the walls. Lava does not have a frequency. What if the Industrial Revolution was actually a recovery mission? What if the great inventions of the 1880s, the light bulb, the phonograph, the wireless transmitter, were not inventions at all, but reverse-engineered fragments of the Tartarian world? Look at the patents of the era. Many of them were filed by men who had never stepped foot in a laboratory until they were granted access to the government's special collections. The institutional gatekeeping began here. By controlling the technology, they controlled the narrative of progress. If you believe you are inventing the future, you will not realize you are merely scavenging the past. The giants were the masters of resonance. They understood that the earth itself is a battery. The star forts were not military fortifications, they were power plants. The bastions and ravelins were not for cannons, they were for the propagation of low-frequency waves. Consider the world's Columbian Exposition of 1893, the pinnacle of this orchestrated deception. A city of white palaces built in a matter of months. We are told it was lath and plaster, meant to be temporary, but the electrical systems installed there were more advanced than anything available in the following 50 years. The White City was a demonstration of the recovered Tartarian aesthetic. It was a test, a way to see how the public would react to the grandeur of the old world before it was systematically burned down. Ask yourself why they would build a 600-ton dome out of plaster. Ask yourself why the statues were 20 feet tall. They were not creating art. They were recreating a memory. And when the fair was over, they set it on fire. The flames consumed the evidence of the giants' craftsmanship, leaving only the photographs and the carefully curated lies of the organizers. The erasure trope is most visible in our cemeteries. If you visit the oldest sections of the colonial graveyards, you will find the headstones are small, weathered, and human scale. But move to the sections established between 1850 and 1890, you will see obelisks, you will see monoliths, you will see massive stone sarcophagi that remain empty. These were not for the dead. They were markers of a reclaimed territory. They were anchors for the new grid. In 1883, a group of workers in Missouri unearthed a burial chamber containing 24 individuals, the shortest of whom was 8.5 feet tall. They were buried with tablets of a blue-tinted metal that resisted rust and heat. The local newspapers reported it with wonder. A week later, the site was condemned. The skeletons were disposed of due to rapid decay. The metal was taken by government officials for analysis. It never returned, not lost, not destroyed. Something else. The blue metal is likely the same material found in the foundation of the Cincinnati basement. It is a high conductivity alloy that shouldn't exist in the 19th century. It is the signature of a global civilization that utilized the magnetic field of the planet. Tartaria was not a country, it was a condition of being where the scale of the world matched the scale of the inhabitant. When we look at the 1883 discovery, we are looking at the final shuttering of that condition. The world was being shrunk, the ceilings were being lowered, the giants were being squeezed out of the physical plane and into the realm of the occult. This is why the late Victorian era was obsessed with spiritualism and seances. They felt the presence of what had been erased. They heard the echoes in the architecture. They were living in a house that still belonged to someone else. The skepticism of authority is the only rational response to a history that contains so many convenient fires. From the Library of Alexandria to the 1883 records in Cincinnati, the pattern of accidental destruction is too consistent to be coincidence. If you want to delete a people, you burn their libraries. If you want to delete a world, you burn their cities. The great fires of the 1800s were a global reset. They were the mechanical erasure of the Tartarian infrastructure. What couldn't be burned was buried. What couldn't be buried was rebranded. The Capitol buildings in every state are the perfect example. We are told they were built by local craftsmen in the mid-1800s using horse and carriage. Look at the stones, look at the weight. Look at the perfection of the masonry. It is a mathematical impossibility for the frontier populations of that time. These were repurposed Tartarian temples, scrubbed of their original symbols and topped with the statues of the new regime. The pseudo-academic language used to justify this is a form of intellectual violence. They use terms like manifest destiny to give a divine mandate to theft. They use archaeological strata to bury the truth under layers of jargon. But the truth is in the load distribution. The truth is in the way a building from 1880 reacts to an earthquake compared to a building from 1980. The old world was built to last for millennia. The new world is built for the duration of a mortgage. This shift in craftsmanship is not an evolution. It is a degradation. We are moving toward a state of total amnesia. In another 100 years, the 1883 discovery will be forgotten entirely, even by those who look for it. The basement in Cincinnati will be filled with concrete. The red granite will be crushed, and the giants will be nothing more than a glitch in an old script. What if the giants are not dead? What if the 1883 discovery was not of their remains, but of their exit? The tunnels in the west, the deep infrastructure, the magnetic conduits, they all point toward a downward migration. Not a burial, not a tomb, something else. There are records of humming sounds coming from the deep mines of the 1880s, sounds that caused the miners to fall into a trance. They spoke of cities of light beneath the crust. They spoke of a silent, tall people who watched them from the shadows. The authorities called it cave madness, but the miners weren't mad. They were seeing the survivors. They were seeing the occupants of the world we thought we had inherited. The 1883 discovery was the moment the surface dwellers realized they were not alone, and the cover-up was the sound of the door being bolted from the inside. The somber reality is that we are the outsiders. We are the urban explorers of our own civilization. We walk through these cities, admire the domes, and photograph the statues, never realizing that we are looking at a crime scene. Every neoclassical pillar is a tombstone for a giant. Every Baroque flourish is a cry for help from a suppressed culture. The 1883 discovery was a warning. It told us that the ground beneath our feet is hollow and the history in our heads is a fabrication. We are living in an unresolved philosophical open loop. If our past is a lie, then our future is a phantom. We are a people without a floor, floating in a vacuum created by those who would rather rule a ruin than serve a masterpiece. The investigation does not end with the bones. It ends with the realization that the bones are ours, and we are the ones being buried. The institutional silence surrounding the 1883 event is not merely a product of time, but a byproduct of intent. In the winter of that year, a series of seismic anomalies were recorded along the 33rd parallel, movements that the burgeoning scientific community of the day attributed to shifting tectonic plates. However, the data reveals a different signature. These were not natural tremors. They were rhythmic. They were percussive. They were resonant. Not a collapse. Not a quake. Something else. In the small towns of the Hudson Valley, residents reported a sound like a great iron bell ringing deep underground, a vibration that shattered glass and caused the local livestock to stand in a perfect, unmoving circle for hours. When the investigators from the newly formed geological surveys arrived, they did not bring seismographs. They brought concrete. They filled the fissures. They capped the wells. They silenced the earth before it could finish its sentence. Ask yourself why the government would spend thousands of dollars to fill a hole in a farmer's field. Ask yourself what they were trying to muffle. The concept of Tartaria has been reduced to a digital ghost story, a fringe theory for the disenfranchised. But look at the maps from the 17th and 18th centuries. Tartaria is there, spanning the vastness of northern Asia and reaching into the Americas. Then, in the mid-19th century, it is gone, deleted. It is replaced by a patchwork of smaller, manageable nation-states. This is the erasure trope in its most grand and terrifying form. We are told that Tartaria was simply a geographic term for a region like the Midwest. But empires are not geographic terms. Civilizations with their own flags, their own monarchs, and their own unique architectural language do not simply dissolve because a cartographer changes his mind. The 1883 discovery in Cincinnati was a remnant of this global entity. The red granite slab was a piece of a nervous system that once stretched across the Bering Strait. It was a node in a wireless network that harvested the static electricity of the atmosphere. Notice the prevalence of the Great Reset. In the late 19th century literature, they didn't call it that then, of course. They called it modernization. They called it the age of efficiency. But the efficiency was gained by cutting the ties to the giants' energy. The giants did not use wires. They did not use coal. They did not use the combustion of dead things to create life. Their architecture was the battery. The domes were the capacitors. The spires were the antennas. In 1883, the last of these atmospheric harvesters were being converted. The copper roofs were stripped and replaced with lead. The internal resonators were removed and sold for scrap. What we see today as decorative elements were once functional components of a planetary power grid. When you remove the resonator, the building becomes a shell. When you remove the history, the people become a mob. The skepticism of authority becomes a necessity when you realize that the primary function of the modern university is to provide a plausible explanation for the impossible. They tell us the pyramids were tombs. They tell us the star forts were for defense against muskets. They tell us the giants were a genetic fluke. But the load distribution of a star fort is entirely inefficient for defense. The angles create blind spots that a child could exploit. However, if you view a star fort as a geometric amplifier for electromagnetic waves, the design becomes perfect. The 1883 discovery was the moment the new authorities realized that the old tech still worked. They found a basement in Cincinnati that was still drawing power from the ionosphere. They found a stone that was still warm. And they realized that if the public knew that energy was free, the entire structure of the 20th century would fail before it began. Consider the orphan trains of the late 1800s, thousands of children, without parents, without records, shipped across the country to settle the new lands. Where did they come from? Why was there such a sudden and massive surplus of parentless children in the wake of the Great Fires? Ask yourself if these children were being moved into the ruins of a world they were never meant to remember. By separating the generations, the architects of the 1883 erasure ensured that the oral history of the giants would die. A child who grows up in a repurposed Tartarian building, told that it was built by his grandfather, will not question the height of the ceilings. He will not question the purpose of the empty copper conduits in the walls. He will simply accept the narrative he is given. He will become a citizen of the lie. The pseudo-academic language used to describe the westward expansion ignores the fact that the pioneers were often moving into fully formed cities. Look at the early photographs of Salt Lake City, of San Francisco, of Denver. You see mud-caked streets and horse-drawn carriages parked in front of massive, ornate stone palaces that look as if they have been there for 500 years. There are no trees. There are no construction cranes. There are no piles of lumber. There is only the finished product standing in a wasteland, not built, not created, something else. These cities were founded in the way a flag is founded on a mountain peak. They were claimed, they were unearthed, they were inhabited by a population that was told they were the builders, while the real builders were being systematically scrubbed from the record. The 1883 discovery of the giant's remains was the most dangerous evidence of all. A building can be renamed, a city can be rebranded, but a body is a biological fact. A 10-foot tall skeleton with a double row of teeth and a brain capacity twice our own is not an anomaly, it is a replacement. It suggests that we are not the peak of evolution, but a downgrade. It suggests that we were engineered to be smaller, more docile, and more dependent. The institutional gatekeeping of the Smithsonian and its global counterparts was designed to prevent this realization. They knew that if man realized he was a diminished version of his ancestors, he would no longer be content to work in the factories and die in the wars of the new elite. He would look to the stars. He would look to the earth. He would look for his inheritance. The staccato rhythm of the late 1880s was the sound of a closing door. The telegraph clicked. The steam engine hissed. The old world of silence and resonance was being drowned out by the noise of the new world. The giants, with their sensitive biology and their connection to the frequency of the planet, could not survive the static. They retreated, or they were hunted, or they were simply phased out of the physical spectrum. The 1883 event was the final audit. It was the moment the management checked the inventory and decided that the last traces of the previous tenants had to be removed. The red granite slab in the Cincinnati basement was a missed item, a clerical error in the grand erasure, and because it remained, the frequency remained. What if the unresolved philosophical open loop is the only thing that keeps us human? What if the search for Tartaria, the search for the giants, is actually a search for our own lost potential? We feel the tension, we feel the mystery, we feel the unsettling sense that we are being watched by the architecture we inhabit. We are like ghosts haunting the giants' houses, trying to remember how to turn on the lights. The 1883 discovery was a flicker of that light. It was a brief, blinding glimpse of the truth before the darkness was restored. But a flicker is enough. Once you have seen the grain of the stone, once you have felt the warmth of the granite, you can never go back to believing the lie. You are no longer a citizen. You are an investigator. The pattern is global. The pattern is ancient. The pattern is being hidden in plain sight. From the ruins of Angkor Wat to the streets of Washington, D.C., the geometry of the giants is everywhere. It is a language of power that we have been taught to read as art. But art does not hold up the roof of the world. Art does not regulate the heartbeat of the population. Something else does. As we move deeper into the evidence, as we look at the maps that shouldn't exist and the bones that were never found, we must ask ourselves the ultimate question. If the giants were erased to make room for us, who will be erased to make room for what comes next? The basement is only the beginning. The ground is still humming, and the door is starting to rattle. The silence of 1886 was different from the silence of 1883. It was a secondary silence, a curated silence, not an absence of sound, not a lack of data. Something else. It was the sound of a vacuum being filled with the white noise of a manufactured history. By this time, the red granite slab in the Cincinnati basement had been confiscated by the Department of the Interior under the guise of an eminent domain dispute involving subterranean water rights. They didn't take the house. They didn't take the land. They took the floor. They excavated exactly 12 feet down, removed the resonant granite, and replaced it with standard issue grey limestone. Ask yourself why a government agency would spend 3 weeks and 40 labourers to swap one stone for another. Ask yourself why the original foreman of that project died of a sudden, unexplained pulmonary edema 3 days after the granite was created. This was the year the Bureau of Ethnology began its most aggressive campaign to reclassify the architecture of North America. Every stone temple was labelled a mound. Every complex irrigation system was labelled a natural runoff. Every masterwork was reduced to a primitive accident. The institutional erasure of Tartaria required a total reordering of the temporal landscape. We are taught that time is linear. We are taught that we are the beneficiaries of a slow, grueling climb out of the mud. But the load distribution of the older world suggests a leap, not an evolution, not a progress. Something else. The buildings of the mid-19th century, those survivors of the pre-reset era, possess a thermal mass that modern engineering cannot replicate without exorbitant cost. They were designed to breathe. They were designed to heal. If you look at the mortar used in the 1880s, the original mortar, not the Portland cement used to patch it later, it contains traces of crushed quartz and a biological binder that suggests it was grown, not mixed. This is the pseudo-academic blind spot. They call it Roman cement to hide the fact that it was a Tartarian standard. In 1883, the secret of this growth was lost, or stolen, or suppressed. What if the giants weren't just taller than us? What if they were denser? Consider the atmospheric pressure of the 19th century. There is evidence in the ice cores of a sudden, violent shift in the oxygen to nitrogen ratio around 1885, a thinning of the air, a change in the very medium of life. A giant with a lung capacity designed for a rich, etheric atmosphere would find our modern air like a poison. They would suffocate in the open sun. They would retreat to the deep infrastructure, to the places where the old pressure remained. The 1883 discovery wasn't just a discovery of bones, it was a discovery of a refuge. The basement in Cincinnati was a pressurized chamber. The red granite was a regulator. When we opened it, we didn't just find a stone, we broke a seal. We let the modern world in, and we let the ancient world bleed out. The skepticism of authority is often dismissed as paranoia, but paranoia is merely the recognition of a pattern before the evidence is fully visible. Look at the maps of the 1880s and again, specifically, look at the railway expansion routes. They do not follow the path of least resistance. They do not follow the shortest distance between 2 points. They follow the ley lines. They follow the buried conduits of the Tartarian power grid. They use the rails not just for transport, but as a grounding wire. By laying thousands of miles of iron across the continent, the new elite created a short circuit in the Earth's natural resonance. They killed the hum. They neutralized the atmospheric electricity that the giants used to build their cities of light. By 1887, the free energy was gone, replaced by a metered wire. Not progress, not innovation. Something else. A cage of copper and coal. The erasure trope is most effective when it is invisible. It is the dog that doesn't bark. It is the building that is never mentioned in the city's founding charter, despite appearing in the background of every early photograph. In 1888, the city of San Francisco renovated its municipal archives. Hundreds of boxes of architectural plans from the 1870s were moved to a temporary warehouse that, predictably, burned to the ground 2 weeks later. This is the cleansing fire in its administrative form. When the physical evidence is too large to hide, you destroy the paper trail. You make it so that the only thing left is the official word of the official historian. And if the official historian says a horse and buggy crew built a marble palace with a 300-foot dome in 6 months, you are expected to believe it. Ask yourself why you don't. Ask yourself what your intuition knows, that your education has been designed to suppress. The rhythm of the investigation leads us to the contrast of scale. In the 1880s, the furniture of the elite began to change. The chairs became smaller. The desks became lower. The ceilings in new constructions were dropped from 20 feet to 10. This wasn't a fashion trend. It was a rebranding of the human experience. By shrinking out our environment, they shrunk our minds. A man who lives in a cathedral thinks like a god. A man who lives in a cubicle thinks like a servant. The giants were erased because their scale was an affront to the new paradigm of control. You cannot rule a being who can see over the walls you build. You cannot manage a population that understands it is the heir to an empire of resonance. So they gave us the industrial age. They gave us the smoke. They gave us the noise. They gave us the illusion that we were moving forward when we were actually being led into a basement. Not all the giants were buried. Not all the stones were replaced. There are still places where the frequency is high. There are still buildings that refuse to be tamed. Have you ever entered a space and felt a sudden, inexplicable pressure in your chest? Have you ever heard a high-pitched ring in a room that was perfectly silent? You are encountering a remnant of the 1883 world. You are standing in a pocket of Tartaria that the cleaners missed. The institutional gatekeepers call it sick building syndrome or acoustic resonance. They give it a name to make it small, to make it manageable, but it is the voice of the giants, calling out through the stone. It is the red granite screaming from beneath the limestone. It is a reminder that the erasure was not complete. What if the 1883 discovery was actually a recovery of a biological weapon? Not a virus, not a toxin, something else. A frequency that targets the pineal gland, a vibration that makes the human spirit docile. The Great Reset of the late 1800s wasn't just about buildings and borders. It was about the internal architecture of the human soul. They replaced the resonance of the earth with the resonance of the machine. They turned the giants' power plants into factories. They turned the Tartarian temples into courthouses and banks. They took the sacred and made it transactional, and they did it so quickly, so violently, that we didn't even notice the change. We just woke up in a smaller world and assumed it had always been this way. The somber truth of the investigation is that we are complicit. We accept the narrative because it is easier than acknowledging the loss. We look at the ruins of Tartaria and call them classical. We look at the bones of the giants and call them hoaxes. We are the children who sold their inheritance for a handful of glass beads, but the beads are breaking. The system of control that was established in 1883 is starting to fray. The load distribution is failing. The earth is starting to ring again, and the deep infrastructure is beginning to surface. Ask yourself what happens when the basement is no longer deep enough to hold the truth. Ask yourself what happens when the giants wake up. We are nearing the center of the pattern. The specific anomaly of the Cincinnati stone has expanded into a global conspiracy of silence. We have identified the erasure. We have felt the tension. We have looked into the eyes of the gatekeepers and seen the fear. They know that history is not a solid thing. It is a fluid. It is a grain that can be redirected, but it always leaves a mark. It always leaves a signature. As we move into the next phase, we will look at the final stand of the Tartarian elite. We will look at the last maps. We will look at the technology that was too powerful to be hidden and too dangerous to be used. The loop is closing, the light is fading, but the evidence is everywhere. You just have to know how to see it. The transition from 1888 into the final decade of the century marked the transition from physical erasure to psychological entrenchment. The giants were no longer being dug up, they were being thought away. The institutional gatekeepers had realized that you do not need to hide the bones if you can make the mind refuse to see them. In 1889, the Great Geological Survey released its definitive report on the subterranean geography of the American basin. It was a masterpiece of pseudo-academic language. It categorized every anomalous void, every glass-lined conduit, and every resonant chamber as karst topography. Not architecture, not infrastructure, something else. By labeling the Tartarian remains as natural geological features, they place them outside the jurisdiction of historians. If it is just a cave, no one asks who carved the stairs. If it is just a rock formation, no one asks why it reflects radio waves. This was the ultimate lock on the library door. Ask yourself about the world's fairs that populated the 1890s: Paris, Chicago, Buffalo, St. Louis. Each one followed the same eerie pattern. A sprawling, high-tech metropolis appears in a mud pit. It features wireless power, moving walkways, and neon illumination that exceeds the capacity of the local power grid. Then it is burned, not dismantled, not recycled. Something else. The demolition of the Chicago World's Fair was an act of ritualistic destruction. They didn't just tear down buildings, they erased a possibility. They showed the public what life could be, a life of beauty, scale, and free energy. And then they told them it was a temporary fantasy. They made the real world feel like a dream, and the industrial nightmare feel like the only reality. This is the hallmark of the revisionist documentary we are living through. We are told the White City was made of staff, a mixture of plaster and fibre. Yet, the black and white photographs show pillars that support thousands of tons of steel. Staff does not have that load distribution. Marble does. Tartarian stone does. The skepticism of authority must extend to the very maps we use to navigate our reality. By 1891, the term Tartaria had been completely removed from the standard educational atlas. In its place was a vast, empty Siberia, and a Central Asia that appeared primitive and sparsely populated. But the ruins tell a different story. In the deserts of the Gobi, in the mountains of the Urals, and in the forests of the Pacific Northwest, the architecture is identical. The same star-fort geometry, the same red granite foundations, the same atmospheric collectors. This was a global civilization, a unified frequency that spanned the oceans. The giants were the bridge. They were the ones who could navigate the ether. When they were removed, the world was fractured into competing nations. War became the new resonance. The great game of the 1890s was not a struggle for land. It was a struggle for the remaining Tartarian tech. Consider the discovery of X-rays in 1895. We are told Wilhelm Röntgen stumbled upon them in a dark lab, but the timing is too convenient. It aligns perfectly with the final cleaning of the 1883 Cincinnati site. The technology to see through solid matter, to peer into the bones of the earth, was a Tartarian legacy. They used it to map the deep infrastructure. They used it to communicate through the stone. When the elite recovered this new science, they didn't use it to heal. They used it to surveil. They used it to ensure that no more red granite slabs remained hidden beneath the floorboards of the common man. The inquisitive mind must ask why every major breakthrough of the late Victorian era has a military or industrial application that favours the state over the individual. It wasn't a revolution of spirit, it was a revolution of the cage. The rhythm of the era was one of frantic burial. In 1896, the Smithsonian lost over 400 crates of artifacts recovered from the mound builder sites of the Mississippi Valley. These were not pottery shards, they were the tablets, the blue metal, the crowns, the anaphora of lost, misplaced, or destroyed becomes a rhythmic thrum in the archival records. Not an accident, not a coincidence, something else. It was a systematic purge of the biological evidence of the giants. If you can eliminate the ancestor, you can redefine the descendant. We were being redefined as labor. The giants were being redefined as myth. This is the tension of the investigative essayist. How do you prove the existence of something that has been professionally disappeared? You look for the negative space. You look for the holes in the story that are exactly the size of a 10-foot king. The somber reality is that the 1883 discovery was the last time the old world tried to speak to us. The ringing of the bells, the vibration of the livestock, the warmth of the stone, these were death rattles. By 1897, the static was too loud. The electrification of the cities had created a frequency fence that locked the human consciousness into a narrow band of survival. We stopped looking at the stars and started looking at the clock. We stopped feeling the resonance of the earth and started feeling the pressure of the debt. The giants, who lived by the rhythm of the planet, could not exist in a world of 60 hertz hum and coal smoke. They faded into the unsettling corners of our maps, the unexplored regions that are actually just the places where the erasure was too difficult to complete. What if the erasure trope is not just about the past, but about the future? If they could erase a global empire like Tartaria in 20 years, what can they do to us? Ask yourself why our modern buildings are designed to fall apart in 50 years. Ask yourself why our history is updated every decade to reflect new social truths, while the physical evidence of the old world is hauled to the landfill. We are being kept in a state of perpetual newness to prevent us from developing a deep memory. The investigator knows that memory is a form of power. A man who remembers the giants cannot be intimidated by a bureaucrat. A man who knows the stone can be warm will not pay for the cold. The investigation now turns to the final threshold, the year 1899, the turn of the century, the moment the reset was declared a success. The star forts had been converted into prisons and asylums. The domes had been stripped of their gold. The giants were dead, buried, or hiding in the deep infrastructure. The 1883 discovery was a distant, ridiculed memory, a tall tale for the uneducated. But as the bells rang in the year 1900, the earth gave one last low-frequency shudder, a final vibration from the red granite deep in a vault somewhere in Washington, D.C. It was a signal, a reminder, an unresolved philosophical open loop that remains to this day. Not a beginning, not an end. Something else. The pattern is complete, but the investigation is never over. We have tracked the anomaly from a Cincinnati basement to a global erasure. We have identified the gatekeepers and their pseudo-academic shields. We have felt the tense, mysterious energy of the Tartarian ruins. We have stood in the shadow of the giants and realized we are the ones living in the dark. The question is no longer, did they exist? The question is, where did they go, and when are they coming back? The ground is still humming. The load distribution of our reality is shifting. The stone is getting warm again. Ask yourself if you are ready to see what is behind the limestone. The loop remains open. The mystery remains somber. The truth remains forbidden. We are the urban explorers of a stolen history, picking through the ruins of an empire we were told never existed. But the grain of the stone does not lie. The frequency does not lie. The giants are still here, written in the geometry of our streets and the marrow of our bones. They are waiting for us to stop being labourers and start being heirs. They are waiting for us to remember, not this, not that, something else. The investigation continues, but the script is yours to finish. The next step is into the light, or deeper into the basement. The turn of the century did not bring the enlightenment promised by the exposition's white lights, but rather a solidification of the shadows. By 1901, the institutional gatekeeping had transitioned from active destruction to passive ridicule. The giants were no longer a matter for the biological sciences. They were transferred to the Department of Folklore. To speak of the 1883 Cincinnati discovery was to invite the smirk of the academic, a social pressure more effective than any gag order. Ask yourself how a culture of rigorous Victorian inquiry became overnight a culture of incurious compliance. Ask yourself why the skeletal remains once proudly displayed in county courthouses were suddenly deemed shameful hoaxes and relegated to furnace rooms. The load distribution of the truth had become too heavy for the fragile narrative of the new century. The giants were not gone, but they were being systematically unknown. In the archives of the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, there is a recurring anomaly in the logistics ledgers. A massive influx of industrial weight silica and pulverized granite was brought into the city, only to be buried beneath the foundations of the temporary pavilions, not used for construction, not sold as material. Something else. It was a mass dampening. They were using the crushed remains of Tartarian resonant stone to insulate the earth from the very frequencies the fair was pretending to showcase. They gave the public the spectacle of electricity while burying the source of the power. This is the erasure trope at its most cynical. They use the skin of the old world to sell the soul of the new. If you look at the aerial photographs of St. Louis from that year, the city layout is a perfect circuit board, yet we are told it was designed by architects who had never seen the site from above. The skeptical investigator must look at the Restoration Act of 1906. Under the guise of safety, thousands of pre-1880 buildings were reinforced with steel skeletons, but the reinforcement often involved stripping the interior walls of their copper mesh and removing the mercury-filled spheres from the roof finials. These were not safety measures, they were lobotomies. They were removing the neural pathways of the architecture. A building that once functioned as a self-sustaining energetic node was turned into a dead pile of a masonry, dependent on the grid, dependent on the meter, dependent on the state. By 1907, the hum had been successfully replaced by the whir of the generator. The giant's legacy was being ground down into the dust of 1,000 construction sites used as filler for the roads of a smaller, faster, and more distracted people. What if the Great Depression was not an economic failure, but a strategic pause, a time to finish the excavations while the world was too hungry to notice? Between 1910 and 1930, the amount of soil moved by government-funded public works projects exceeded the total volume of the Himalayan range. They were levelling the mounds, they were filling the tunnels, they were ensuring that the deep infrastructure was so deep it could never be reached by accident again. The 1883 discovery was a mistake they vowed never to repeat. They realised that the physical world is persistent, it leaves clues in the strata. So they changed the strata. They terraformed the continent to match the history books. Not a restoration, not a development, something else, a burial. The contrast of scale becomes most haunting when you look at the monuments we were told to build in the early 20th century. Consider the Lincoln Memorial or the Supreme Court. They are vast, echoing halls of stone built in a style they call Greek Revival. But they are sterile, they are cold, they have the shape of the giants' temples, but none of the resonance. They are mockeries. They are the new elite wearing the clothes of the old masters to convince us they are the same. Ask yourself why we feel so small in these buildings. It is not because of their beauty, it is because they were designed to make us feel like intruders in our own capital. They are the psychological anchors of the erasure, reminders that the power is no longer in the stone, but in the men who sit behind the desks. The rhythmic sentence structure of the 1920s was one of jazz and static, a frantic effort to drown out the silence of the lost world. But in the rural pockets of the Appalachians, the old knowledge persisted. The people there spoke of the blue people and the tall ones who lived in the mines. They spoke of light trees that grew in the dark and singing stones that could heal a broken limb. The institutional gatekeepers responded with the eugenics movement, a pseudoscience designed to categorize these people as degenerate and unfit. If you couldn't erase the memory, you discredited the person remembering. This is the most somber part of the investigation, the realization that the war on Tartaria was also a war on the human imagination. By 1933, exactly 50 years after the Cincinnati stone was unearthed, the loop was almost closed. The last of the original witnesses to the 1883 event were dying off. Their journals were being archived into oblivion. Their photographs were fading into silver ghosts. The world was preparing for another great fire, a global conflict that would provide the ultimate cover for the final cleaning of the Eurasian heartland. The maps were being redrawn again, the names were being changed again, Tartaria was no longer even a memory. It was a void, a place where nothing happened for 1,000 years until we arrived to claim it. What if the giants are not a biological race, but a state of being? What if the size reported in 1883 was a physical manifestation of a consciousness that was in harmony with the planet's resonance? As the frequency was lowered, the bodies shrank. As the ether was poisoned, the spirit diminished. We are not a different species. We are a stunted version of the same one. The erasure was a genetic and energetic bottleneck forced upon us by those who knew that a giant cannot be enslaved, but a man can. The somber, inquisitive mind must ask, if we were made small, can we be made large again? Is the 1883 discovery a map for our return? The tension in the air today is the sound of the bottleneck breaking. The static is failing. The frequency fence is developing holes. People are starting to look at the old buildings again, not as art, but as technology. They are starting to notice the load distribution. They are starting to touch the stone and feel the warmth. The revisionist documentary is being unmasked. The narrator is being challenged. We are stepping out of the first-person perspective of the victim and into the first-person perspective of the investigator. We are no longer asking what happened. We are asking, how do we fix it? The pattern is expanding once more. The 1883 discovery was just the first domino. The giants are waking up in our DNA. The Tartarian resonance is bleeding through the concrete. The unresolved philosophical open loop is finally starting to pull us forward. Not into the past, not into the future, something else. Into the reality that was always there, waiting for us to be big enough to see it. The basement is empty now. The red granite is gone, but the frequency remains, and the frequency is the only thing they could never truly erase.